I want to throw out an actual case and just hear how he explains it. I think it'd be fun to look at this case from Craig Keener's book. Got to kind of get that right there. There we go. On miracles. And this is a case where his long-term close friend, Malaise Woldenstack, a minister from Ethiopia, shared with him accounts of healings in the United States, including the healing of a physician and his wife for whom he prayed on the same night. Malaise referred me to the physician in question. Whereas most cured people do not retain or even know how to obtain medical records, this man, being a physician, did so and provided me extensive copies detailing the test results. So the physician shared that he initially experienced a chest pain from an infection, which he seemed to start recovering from until he began coughing up a bunch of blood. He approached a colleague who was a pulmonologist, who would know about these sort of things, who found not only an infection, but also a suspicious lesion on the CT scan. A second CT scan confirmed this mass. It was this lesion, rather than the infection, that concerned the pulmonologist friend. Although only a biopsy could determine whether the mass was cancerous, they expected it to be malignant based on their usual experience with lung lesions. Okay, so then that's sort of the setup. After prayer with this pastor from Ethiopia, Malaise, and some others, the physician went for the biopsy. His colleague who did the biopsy could not locate any tumor and therefore biopsied tissue where the tumor was supposed to be. The biopsy indicated not only no cancer, but no tumor at all. Another CT scan confirmed this result. A full body PET scan intended to see if the cancer had spread. So you might say, oh, well, it's gone somewhere. No, the PET scan confirmed that there was no cancer anywhere in his body. The physician observed in conversation with me that he believed he had been miraculously healed. He noted that in his own practice, any patient with the same initial results he found had faced one of two prospects. Either the person had to have a lung or part of the lung removed, plus radiation therapy, if the diagnosis came early, or the patient died. Mm-hmm. In subsequent conversation, he allowed that plenty of unexplained anomalies happen in medicine. A doctor could thus be hard-pressed to pronounce any given anomaly certainly miraculous. But neither he nor the pulmonologist regarded this case as medically normal, since such masses, even when benign, do not usually simply disappear. Mm-hmm. By contrast, this unexpected recovery fits a larger pattern of healings when Malaise prays and in the circles in which he moves. I realize that's a messy case. It's not the typical epistemology case. Yeah. And, so you're welcome to sort of strain out extraneous things. But I thought it's super interesting because here you have a case of healing, supposed healing, that actually happened to a doctor, and you have the test results.
Right. Yeah. So you can see, like, here's how it was before, here's how it was after. And it's not, one of the typical cases where people will say, like, well, they're superstitious or they don't know any better. Presumably, you've got all trained people. And then, as I mentioned, as part of a pattern or a seeming pattern of people this pastor's prayed for. It strikes me that, at least from the information, it could easily be a case where the best explanation is, it's a healing. The other explanations would be something, they'd have to come up with something like they made errors on the initial scans. So that would require, which is possible, but two of them, so that makes it a lot less likely that, there was two different scans that showed the mass, and then were somehow both were mistaken. That's possible, but not very likely at all. Especially one of the things that makes a big difference when it comes to evaluating explanations, whether it's in my sort of phenomenal explanationist view or, say, a broader best explanation, is background evidence. And if you've got background evidence that supports that God exists and that God will on occasion heal, then you've got a really good fit. Now, if someone is a naturalist and they want to insist that, there's no God and there's no, so nothing like that could happen, then the explanation that there was some sort of error would have to be the best explanation given that. But the problem is you don't have evidence for that sort of naturalism. And so I think if you even if we look at it from a more, even a standpoint that's kind of just more neutral, even say, well, we've got, say you're agnostic, right? So someone, their background evidence is, maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't. They haven't ruled it out. You look at the odds that the two scans were mistaken, when you've got the medical records and the physicians think this versus the explanation offered by, no, it was a healing and there's a pattern with this guy. I think even then it stacks up pretty well in favor of this being a miraculous healing.
Wow. So even the naturalists would have a hard time of coming up with a explanation that's more plausible that would rule out it being miraculous.
Yes, I think the naturalist, they're committed to saying, well, so if we build in naturalism into the background, right? So what, there's no God and there can be none of this, then the best explanation will have to be one of these naturalistic explanations. But if we don't build that in, because that from the start just presupposes that it couldn't have been a healing, right? But if you don't build in that presupposition, right? So if you start out with even a neutral position, now presumably the explanatory quality falls more on the side of that it's a healing. So it's really going to depend, I think, which makes sense. If you stack the deck against it being a healing, then what do you know? It's going to end up, your evidence is not going to support that. But if you don't, I think it comes out pretty favorable.
This might be a good case to use with an agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah,
I think with an agnostic, if they're really open and say, well, look, I don't know, and I haven't ruled these things out, say, okay, well, what about this sort of case? Which, and especially when you build in the pattern of this guy's done this before, it seems like they're going to have to at least say, well, there's something about when this guy prays for people, there's some connection there between that and people getting better. And then if the agnostic is, they seem committed, they're going to have to say that there's something going on there. Statistically, it would just be incredibly unlikely that would just by fluke, this guy prays and the people get better, like in following a pattern. And then, then it's up to them to say, okay, well, once you've got them that far, say, well, okay, what best explains this? Here's a simple explanation. He prays and God answers the prayers.
That's good. And I like that because a lot of responses about prayer is that it's sort of amounts to wishful thinking, or you pray for someone and then, especially if they know about it, if they know about petitionary prayer, and they're more likely to recover because they feel supported or they feel, right. But this is, I don't know exactly the amount of time, but it's relatively instantaneous.
Relatively quick. Yeah. And
it's not just a chronic issue. It's acute.
Right.
This is super
that's
acute.
Right.
And so you've got those two scores on which to claim that somehow this guy's pattern of prayer is doing some sort of work that makes the person feel better about their condition and therefore more likely to recover. That becomes pretty definitely not the best explanation of this case.
Right. Yeah, it becomes kind of hard to swallow that, especially when it's like, well, knowing that you're supported and your wishful thinking typically doesn't make a cancerous tumor disappear.
It's like, I'm out of here.
Yeah, it'd be pretty nice to go to we just send a lot more people to the cancer wards and say, hey, we're rooting for you. And then
we're rooting for you. Yeah. I've seen you have a mass and I'm saying, get out of here.
Yeah, just feel good. And, that'd be great. But I don't think that's how it works,
And then I'd love to hear, we'll do two more things if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah,
I'd love to hear one case That's from your book, your excellent
Okay, great. Sure.
epistemology, 50 different puzzles and thought experiments and paradoxes. It is a case that plagues phenomenal conservatism, but I'm assuming your view, PE is able to handle it, and it's the bird watching case.
Oh, good, yeah.
Okay, so I will just briefly read it from the book. So John and Deshawn have decided to spend the afternoon bird watching. Deshawn is an expert when it comes to bird watching, but John is a complete novice. At one point, they both see a fairly large bird with brownish feathers and a distinctive red tail. Deshawn immediately recognizes this because of these and other features, the bird as a red-tailed hawk. John thinks it's a red-tailed hawk too. Neither Deshawn nor John specifically call to mind particular beliefs or information about the distinctive features of this particular kind of bird. Rather, they just both simply see the bird and form the belief that it's a red-tailed hawk. It seems clear in this case that Deshawn's belief is justified, but John's isn't. Although it is immediately clear what a theory of justification should say in this case. Although it's immediately clear what a theory of justification should say, it isn't immediately clear how a theory like phenomenal conservatism, I always say conservatism.
Yeah.
I always do.
Yeah.
I don't know why I add the tivism. It's like you ever study ethics, the contract theory, and there's like a view contractitarianism or something.
Yeah. That's right.
I always contract, and then there's different variations on it too. There's contractarianism, and there's contractitarianism.
Yeah.
Anyway. For some reason, I always say phenomenal conservatism, but it's just tism.
Tism,
anyway, it's just my issue. After all, Deshawn and John are seeing the same bird in the same conditions. Doesn't this mean that they're having the same appearances or seemings? Mm-hmm. And if they both have the same seeming, and it provides for justification for one of them, shouldn't it provide justification for the other? Now, there's lots of different responses that you canvass, so people can go check that out in the book. But I'd love to hear from you just sort of how PE overcomes this worry about PC or phenomenal conservatism.
Yeah, great. That's a great question, Christopher. So this is one of the things that kind of motivated my initial stuff on phenomenal explanationism back before Luca and I teamed up for the book, and that's. We want to say, in some sense, the expert, even so, if we grant that they have the same seeming, so some phenomenal conservatives will deny that. They'll say, well, no, the expert, you actually, so Eli Chudnoff has some good work about perceptual learning. And so he'll say something like, experts actually see different things, like their perceptual experience actually changes with their training. But if we grant that they have the same seeming, the phenomenal conservative seems to be committed to claiming they're both equally justified, which seems incorrect. Phenomenal explanationism isn't committed to that, though, because on the phenomenal explanationist picture, right, it's not just the seeming, but it's the overall explanatory setup, right? So in Deshawn's case, he has this appearance of a red-tailed hawk, and he's got all this background information, all this, that's memories of what red-tailed hawks look like, memories that he's, an expert on what birds look like, all these memories about and evidence about that he's good at identifying these things. This is the sort of thing he would know and all that. Putting all that together, the best explanation of why it seems to him that it's a red-tailed hawk is that it's a red-tailed hawk. But when you talk about John's a novice. So he's got all this background information, that includes things like, I don't know what what various birds look like just by looking at them. I don't know the distinguishing features of a red-tailed hawk and so on. Now, even if he's not consciously thinking of it, since phenomenal explanationism is a mentalist view, he's got all this additional evidence. As a result of that, it's not the case that the best explanation of his total evidence is that this is a red-tailed hawk. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. What if we stipulate that John doesn't have any of that at all? He's a novice, and he's so novice that he's not even aware that he's a novice. Now it might be that it's a red-tailed hawk is the best explanation, but it's not a very good explanation, right? Because there's all these other
proviso about it's got to be a good
one, yeah. Because he doesn't have much evidence now. Now all he has is, I have this appearance, red-tailed hawk, but he doesn't have any information about like even what red-tailed hawks look like or none of this. And so you might think here he doesn't have a rich enough evidence base in order for this explanation, if it were the best, to be justified. Plus, we can also think if there's various rivals that, well, no, this is some other sort of hawk, and I've miscategorized it, or some other, given that he's a complete novice, it could be any of a number of birds that would fit his evidence just as well. Like if he just has this visual experience, given what he knows about birds, he's really only probably justified in believing here's a bird, with certain colors.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that. So the background evidence is what really is playing the big role here. Yeah.
Okay. And so because the background evidence is separating the cases in terms of best explanation, does your view wash out in terms of it would give the same explanation as phenomenal evidentialism? Because plausibly on a phenomenal evidentialist view, you would have a total evidence proviso. So
yes.
Would it align with phenomenal evidentialism with regard to
Yeah, absolutely. Because phenomenal explanationism is a form of evidentialism.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it would be if it were, say, a different evidentialist view that maybe construed evidential support in some other way than explanatory. Maybe it's just some other explanation of fit. Could still end up with the same result of saying, well, you look at the total evidence, and given this total evidence, this, you could even, maybe, I'm a little hesitant on this, but because I actually don't think they can come apart as easily as this, but say if you had a view that was just in terms of the probabilities, you might have a total evidence view that says, well, given all of Deshaun's background evidence, it's really unlikely that he's wrong about this being a red-tailed hawk. Given John's, it's really likely that he is wrong because he doesn't have anything. And so, you might think of it in that sort of terms. The reason why I mentioned I'm hesitant is because I think you can't get a lot of the probability stuff off the ground without explanatory stuff doing some heavy lifting. But that's
okay. And I also saw a paper, and we didn't talk about this now, but I could provide a link to it where you go back and forth with somebody, if I'm not mistaken, about the evidential value of explanations and why. Yeah. And it got a little technical, so I didn't go into it in this talk, but that might be another thing people could look at. Is that right? Right.
Yeah. So there's a few places where I've done that. So Ted Poston and I have a couple papers where we argue that explanatoriness is evidentially relevant. And so
that's
we
right.
have
that was the paper I was talking, or one of the papers I was talking about. Yes.
We have a debate back and forth and a few things with Elliot Sober and William Rausch about the ways that even within a probabilistic framework, like they like a Bayesian framework, that explanatoriness can still have a role to play and still does have various roles to play. Yeah.
Okay, great. Lastly, I'd like to briefly mention Liz Jackson's forthcoming article in a volume that you've co-edited, Seemings. And I mentioned this in the main video, Coffee with Philosophers, New Arguments, New Angles. And in that paper, essentially, Liz argues that if seemings are evidence, then, and people that disagree really sort of rarely share the same evidence. And this might connect back to a point you made earlier that like the expert will have a different perceptual experience or seeming as compared to the novice. And perhaps I haven't read all of Liz's paper, but I just thought I'd get your initial impression on this. Perhaps one way of pushing it is saying seemings are person relative, and they are the content of the seeming, the actual content is filled out in very individualized ways that make it such that two people are very unlikely to ever share the same seeming. And
Right.
for that reason, how can seemings be evidence if one of the big sort of hallmarks of evidence is that it can be shared. It can be a common thing people point to and go, yeah, that supports this or doesn't. So if people can't share the same evidence because seemings are evidence and people can't share them, then people that disagree are going to have a hard time, like reasonably disagreeing, rationally disagreeing. They might just be talking past each other at all times.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Yeah, I think sometimes when we do talk about evidence being the sort of thing that we directly share, we're talking about we have to be careful between, like, I forget the term that they use, but there's justifying evidence, and then there's other things that we might call material evidence. So, in a court case, a bloody knife is evidence, but that's not justifying evidence. That doesn't give us a reason to believe anything unless I'm aware of the knife and I'm aware of, its relevance to the case at hand. And so the justifying evidence is always going to be mental states. And so Liz's sort of worry is about, so there's kind of in the ontology of evidence, there's two broad views. One is what's called propositionalism, which says evidence consists of propositions. And then there's various ways that people will distinguish, well, which propositions count as your evidence. So some people say only the propositions that you know. Some will say, on the other end, maybe just only the propositions you believe. Others, only the ones you justifiably believe, however they want to do it. But then the other view, which phenomenal explanationism and phenomenal conservatism and other views hold, is what's sometimes called psychologism, which is just, it's not the proposition that's evidence. It's actually the mental state itself is your evidence. So, for instance, if you, on this sort of view, if you are currently feeling a pain, the propositionalist says your evidence is that you feel this pain or whatever. That's the evidence. Whereas the view on the psychologism side, the phenomenal view of evidence, says, no, your evidence is that pain experience itself. And I think that's pretty plausible. So then Liz's worry is, just as we can't share pains, contrary to this will kind of date me a bit, but when Bill Clinton said, I feel your pain, literally speaking, he doesn't and didn't feel anyone's pain but his own, because we can't share pains directly. And so her worry is, well, we can't share evidence directly. But I think that misses some important things for the disagreement. So her thought is, a lot of the disagreement literature, we only have a sort of interesting case of pure disagreement when we've shared our evidence, and then we still disagree. But if we can't share our evidence, we can't have this sort of disagreement. And so this is thought to be a problem. Well, there's a number of things to say here. One is, we can have the same type of evidence. We just don't have tokens of it. So one thing to think is in terms of beliefs. If you and I both look at the same tree, we believe that there's a tree. You have one token of that belief, and I have another token of that belief, right? We both have a belief of the same type, that there's a tree, and other particulars about it. But the token only exists in one, for one of us. We can never both have the same token because it's a particular concrete, in some sense, concrete thing, right? So there's just so even if it's non-physical, it's a particular instance of that belief that only one of us has. But it still makes sense to say we believe the same thing, right? And if it's going to be a problem for evidence, it's going to be weird because it's going to be a problem in saying, well, we're supposed to somehow have the same evidence, but this is a problem because you can't literally have the same mental state. But there's no problem in saying we have the same belief, even though we don't have the same token of belief. So you might think something similar here in this sense. You have an appearance as of there being a tree, and I have an appearance as of there being a tree. In one sense, we have the same evidence. We have two tokens of the same type, right? An appearance of the tree. So that's one thing to say a bit in response to her. But another thing is this, that even if you can't, if you set that aside, you say, well, that doesn't work. It doesn't matter if you can share the exact evidence. All that matters for a disagreement case is that in the end, we have the same body of relevant evidence. And if you accept a very plausible principle that Rich Feldman called the evidence of evidence principle, then you can have that. And his principle is simply this, that if I have good evidence that you have good evidence in support of believing something, then that is itself evidence for me to believe that thing. So if, say, I haven't seen a particular math problem, but I have really good evidence that you've solved the math problem and that your answer is 72, that's evidence for me that the answer is 72, because I have evidence that you have evidence that it's 72, which is evidence for me that it's 72. And so you might think in a disagreement case, all that has to, when we share our evidence, if I find out, if you believe P and I believe not P, when I learn that you believe P, I now have evidence that Christopher has evidence in support of P, which is evidence in support of P. So I can still get the same sort of worries that people have about disagreement stuff. You can still get the same sort of sharing of evidence in the relevant sense without giving up on the idea that our evidence consists of mental states. And it's interesting that she's worried about this in the disagreement literature, because one of the very early moves in that literature was in the, I think it's 1996 paper where Peter Van Inwagen, one of the early people talking about this in the contemporary discussion, mentions a disagreement between himself and David Lewis over free will. And he posits, at least in that initial paper, that, well, maybe I have just some sort of insight that I can't communicate to Lewis, and that's why I am justified in keeping my position, even though we've shared all this other evidence. So I've got evidence he doesn't have, and I can't explain it to him. Well, very quickly in the literature, people said, well, wait a minute. If you've already admitted that your peers, like he's just as smart as you, just as well informed. If you have this sort of insight, then plausibly you've got good reason to think he has a similar sort of insight. And so you're stuck. And so, without being able to share your insight, you still can create this sort of peer disagreement because you might have evidence that the other person has a similar insight. So that's kind of a long way of saying, I don't see a problem here for any sort of phenomenal view of evidence when it comes to disagreement, because it's not clear that to have the sort of disagreement case set up that you really need to share evidence in that exact way where we have the same tokens. Yeah, that's kind of a long answer to that.
No, that's helpful. And I know you said the first way of responding, and then the second way, though, I'm wondering if she could push back by just saying the evidence of evidence counting as evidence principle is false.
Yeah, she might. I mean, I think you'd have a tough.
That might be a tough road to go, but
yeah, because you could go that route and say, no, look, having evidence that someone else has evidence doesn't give you evidence.
Right.
Yeah, you might go that route, but that's going to be a difficult one, I think.
Or it gives you such minimal evidence that it's not the sort of evidence that could ever mount up to justify you in believing that P. I guess maybe your view could add up all the other relevant evidence, and then it could justify you moving your credence in a different direction. But I guess to counter the actual relevant principle, you'd have to say evidence of evidence is never evidence, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That seems bad.
That'd be a tough, yeah.
That would be tough, yeah.
That'd be a tough road to hoe.
Yeah.
All right. And so finally, I'd love for you just to share, you've already, for your age, I won't mention your age unless you want to, but you've already accomplished a lot. It's very impressive. And I just want to encourage you and just say, keep going. You're doing great work. Is there anything, let's say people are outside academia and they love reading philosophy of religion. Most of my viewers are this way. They just love it. They're just passionate about it. And they want to grow as philosophers, but for whatever reason, it may not be a good time or may not have the resources to jump into a philosophy program. What would you recommend for them in terms of studying philosophy of religion, and sort of tips, hacks, anything that comes to mind that they could do that would sort of move them along or expedite their growth as a Christian philosopher?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, especially if they're already reading good philosophy of religion, that's a thing to do, and like philosophical theology and so on. But maybe depending on the particular questions that they're interested in, look at the general work in that area too, right? So if you're interested in, say, things like justification of religious belief and so on, so don't just read the philosophy of religion on those topics, but look broader at, say, epistemology in general, and look at things like good introductory texts. So I still think it's a little expensive, but you might be able to find cheaper copies. Rich Feldman's little book just called Epistemology is an excellent sort of general resource on epistemology, because I think with a lot of philosophy of religion, I think is this way. It's a lot of the questions are questions that are, in a sense, part of other domains of philosophy as well. So certain things fall under epistemology, certain things fall under metaphysics, certain things fall under ethics. And having a kind of a deeper and broader sort of background in that area, I think, can really help someone improve as a Christian philosopher, because it'll help them in getting a deeper understanding of some of the issues and then bringing those to bear. I think that's what some of the best Christian philosophers have done. So I think people like Flanagan, Swinburne, and others have done that very thing. They're really sharp on a number of areas of philosophy, and then they bring it to bear on particular issues in philosophy of religion. So that would be that big advice would be for the areas that you're particularly interested in. Focus on, of course, the philosophy of religion in that area, but then expand and look at what's going on in the general discipline itself. And making use of there are good introductory texts, like I mentioned, like Feldman's textbook. There's good making use of the free resources too, like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy often has really good entries on things, and just kind of working from there. But especially kind of start with the sort of general introductory text to get a grounding in it, and then continue to kind of layer on, and that'll help, I think, a lot. And just you can come to the debates in philosophy of religion with a strong grasp of the general philosophy of that area. And I think that's a really good way to kind of to improve as a philosopher of religion, and just in thinking more clearly about the issues. But of course, I mean, don't stop reading the philosophy of religion in the process, but kind of do all of that and try to bring it in. So that, and like I said, the free resources, those are probably my main two tips for that. Yeah, and those are really great things to do. Yeah, watch.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I just want to underline that. Yeah. And I just want to underline that very thing, because what I've found, so I come from pretty much total secular philosophy world. And as I've gotten deeper, I mean, I taught a course on philosophy of religion, upper division course. And, so I've dabbled in philosophy of religion, but now that's my main focus. And as I've gotten into the philosophy of religion literature, I do find often that there are there's gaps in the knowledge that I want to just sort of say, wait, are you aware of this bigger picture? And I'll just give you one, for instance. In the work on divine love, God's love, there's a very influential view, Eleanor Stump's view, which is an Aquinas-based view, which is that there's two different desires that constitute God's love: the desire for union, and then the desire for the well-being or the beneficence desire, the well-being of the other for the sake of the other. But yet, when you look at just the Stanford Encyclopedia article, going back to your suggestion with the free resources on love, just the philosophy of love, Stump's view is just one tiny little sliver of a perspective on love. So her view is love is robust concern for the other person. But there are all these different views, like an emotional view. Right. And then that could shed light. Well, if you think, well, maybe that's not the best view. Maybe a view that really countenances the emotional aspect of love is really important. Then that might feed back into your philosophy of religion, such that, well, maybe God's not impassible. Maybe God can change and have emotional experiences and respond to his creatures in an emotional capacity. So there can be sort of going back to to Kevin's excellent point, there can be this back and forth, this mutual reinforcing and deepening that can occur at the same time if you sort of hold both literatures in your hands and go.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Yeah, I completely agree.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for your time, and thank you for your work. And I'll provide a link to all your books and your resources. And where's the best place for people to reach you? Is it at your website?
Yeah, they can just get on my website. It's just my name, kevinmccain.org. And that has like CV research. It's got my email address on the CV and stuff. So yeah, they can shoot me an email if they want to talk about something, whatever.
Follow Kevin, and we'll see you in the next episode of the podcast.
Thank you.